Thank you. Yeah, so Joe commented in the Slack, and I posted on the issue the reasons why this came up in SIG architecture, and I think either Clayton or Jordan raised the issue. And both of them are API approvers. And so, yeah, the issue is purely one of consistency across the system. What kinds of APIs do we want to use, and what should the level of consistency be? What should the requirements on those APIs be? In the past, we pushed back on introducing some new types of APIs. For example, there was a PR at one point for a webhook API for the cloud provider interface that had totally different conventions from the user-facing API. So we pushed back on that, and that didn't get merged, and we eventually decided to do that a whole different way anyway. But I posted the different types we currently have to the PR, but basically we have the user-facing API, which we use in a number of different ways, such as for component configuration and for serialization in etcd and for some existing webhooks from the API server. We have an execution-based plugins in kubelet and in kubectl. And kubectl, the reason is probably pretty obvious why. And we have a gRPC API in kubelet currently for CRI. So I started writing down shortly before this meeting some rationales. So I started creating this, another topic for today's design documentation backlog. I have like a list of stuff in my to-do list that never gets out, of things that come up in PR reviews and proposal reviews and other discussions that need to get documented. And I want to start chipping away at that backlog, as well as surface other things that come up kind of more systematically in the future. But so the current API conventions apply to user-facing APIs. For all different flavors of users. They may be used declaratively or by a large number of clients. Component configuration, serialized persistently, and currently, someone's making a lot of noise. In webhooks, we have advocated for, in the case where the API schema may also be used in one of the other cases, where we expect a large number of hook receiver implementations, where hooks make a simple policy decision like yes, no, or or where hook implementers may want to run the logic on a functions platform or something like that. The one case of gRPC we have is for an imperative style API that needs to be reasonably high performance, but we expect a relatively small number of implementations and a single client point. So it's a much more constrained interface. I don't remember what CRI is doing about versioning, but if we want to impose like meta requirements on APIs, probably some kind of versioning strategy needs to be one of them, whether it's, support 2 different APIs for an extended period for the whole deprecation policy period, or, some more principled form of versioning. It's TBD.
So Brian, I real quick, I think there's another gRPC API, and it's not a Kubernetes one, but it's definitely entangled in our system, and that is the API to etcd.
Yes, that is true.
That's not our API though.
Well, I mean, it's so entangled in terms of how we think about things, and the reasons why that's gRPC and not JSON is an important historical. That we had a hand in influencing the move for etcd to gRPC over JSON, right? And so understanding the reasons around that is
the fact that our storage interface still includes, we still have a etcd2 implementation. So like the gRPC stuff is contained within the etcd client. That's not bleeding out through the storage interface.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that understanding the reasons for why etcd moved to gRPC with etcd3, how that impacted the system as a whole, I think is instructive in terms of informing the discussions of when something like gRPC might be appropriate as we look at other places. That's all I'm trying to say there.
Okay.
And it's definitely part of our architecture, whether we define it or not.
That's a great point. I actually think for etcd, the change to binary was far more important. That a binary protocol as opposed to text was far more important than gRPC versus some other transport mechanism. But definitely that should inform the decision. So I think it's clear that there are different flavors of APIs and different use cases. The etcd one is not a declarative API. It has basically a single client point and a small number of implementations, which is one at the moment. May not stay one forever, but it's one at the moment. So in that way, CRI and etcd are similar. And I think the KMS is similar to that. There were some interesting points about, what does this do with respect to credential management? Does it make it different from everything else put on the list? So Jordan, did you want to say anything about that? Or
I actually was unsure whether we were expecting this to be credentialed at first. I was sort of expecting it to be exposed over domain socket locally, so you weren't having to hit the network. Sort of get into chicken and egg scenarios if you're wanting to distribute credentials to use this, but this is being used to encrypt and decrypt credentials distributed via the API. In the document that was linked, there was a pretty strong agreement that this would start as a local socket, so we wouldn't be going over network.
Okay. Do you want to speak to that, Daniel? Like, I know there are plans to talk to external KMSs and to Vault. Is this going to be communicating over domain socket? I think
chat. He said, yes, agree. This is supposed to be co-located. I think the point is that when we're integrating with external systems, how those things are setting up trust relationships is very different and is supposed to be outside of the scope of the API server to worry about.
Yeah, I think for KMS specifically, we're looking at it like CNI or like any of the node local stuff where it's like, it's externalized so that we can have a separate binary. It's not externalized from we want it to be a different network device.
I think, from that point of view, it's similar in some ways to the HashiCorp plugin model where it's a little bit different because it's more envelope-y in terms of it executes the thing and manages execution in addition to using gRPC, but there still is that tight coupling within a local context versus trying to do this over the network.
Yeah. And if you had a system where you did want to call out to some system externally, you could do that. You would just be responsible for managing the security of that from your locally exposed endpoint or locally exposed socket.
Yeah, I think that you could definitely make it be not local if you wanted to, but it'd be on you to figure it out.
Yep. So if we start with it locally exposed as a socket, that lets us not worry about how we identify to it. We're just handling it like a normal file system permission. I think that's a good place to start, especially for the way we're wanting to use it, which is to encrypt secrets, which is
and I don't think we're expecting that it is at all multi-tenant, and we're not designing it to be multi-tenant, right? Like, it's not intended to have different people access it. It's intended to only have the API server access.
Can someone say what the versioning strategy is?
So I was looking at how CNI or CRI deals with versioning, and it looks like one of the methods in the service is version, which lets you introspect what version of the CRI API the plugin supports. And so the kubelet can call out and say, I'm requesting you to tell me what version you are, and here's the version that I am speaking. And then the plugin can respond and say what version it is speaking and some identifying information. It's its name and version, I guess, which is, I think, mostly for logging, but I'm not sure.
Yay, user agents. I mean, like, that invites abuse, to be honest.
Well,
what are you going to do? Yeah.
It lets the kubelet handshake with the CRI plugin to say, I'm speaking v1 alpha 1, are you speaking v1 alpha 1? And determine, to begin, like, are we both speaking a level we understand? So I would expect something similar in any API we had. So in addition to the encode, decode, or encrypt, decrypt methods, have a version method where each side declares what they're doing and whether they can work with each other.
Is that in the same service as all the other calls?
Yeah. So the runtime service declared in the kubelet, the very first thing is the version.
Because I would assume we need, like metadata, we need it to be actually common across multiple versions.
Yeah. So I think if you were going to have multiple versions of the runtime service for CRI, the version request and response would need to stay backwards compatible. And the version is the first tagged field. And from what I can tell, that is the one that is essential in determining compatibility. So that seems like a reasonable pattern to follow.
So Daniel says he thought gRPC handled the version. I don't see how that's possible, but
I was going to say, I think I agree with LavaLamp in that you can get a list of which interfaces, which gRPC services rather are declared, but you don't necessarily want to declare a new or are supported by a service, but you don't necessarily want to declare a new gRPC service for each minor bump. So which I presume is the point of the version field, so that we can essentially do some versioning. But if we had a major revision of the API, we could declare KMSv2, but we don't want to have to declare KMSv2.1, for example. That would be my understanding or guess.
I think there's no, I mean, the last time I checked anyway, there was no, you could check what services, but there wasn't a full discovery API along the lines of OpenAPI to get.
Well, I think just having, I think there's two levels of discovery here. So three levels maybe. There's the API compatibility, which is what you get with gRPC and protobufs, where you know that at least you'll have, if you follow a certain level of rules, you'll have some level of binary compatibility. There's discovering semantic rules and assumptions, right? And that may change over things, even with the same interface. You may say, okay, with this version, we're expecting that there'll be a certain set of rules. And so that helps you avoid sort of user agent hackiness. And then the third thing is being able to do true introspection, where you can say, okay, show me all the fields and all that, and you can write generic clients against it. I think adding a version method to a gRPC service lets you hoist from sort of the syntactic compatibility to semantic querying.
Right. Where if you add a new field and you are if you send that field that changes the meaning of some of the other fields, like what should happen, that probably requires a version bump, because in order to use that, the thing you're calling has to know you are at this new semantic level and pay attention to that instead of just ignoring unknown proto fields.
Yeah, because I think if we look at CNI and all the issues around initializing CNI and what happens when things fail and what are the failure semantics, it's exactly the same interface, really. I mean, it's not gRPC, it's because it's an exec interface, but there's a semantic change, or at least a semantic clarification, as we move from one version to another with CNI.
Okay. So I think we have a decision effectively, which is gRPC is appropriate to this for this API. I'm writing down some in the documentation backlog. I'm writing down some criteria, like the API is imperative. There's basically a single in-system client, and we expect a small number, relatively, of server implementations. And it's going to be, especially, it's going to be local on the same node. In order for this to go forward, so just a second, Joe, in order for this to go forward, we at least need to clarify that it's going to be local, a local call, and that we expect to use a similar versioning approach as for CRI. Yeah.
And I'd say part of that local implication is that this is essentially outside of the sort of authentication authorization model that we've built for the rest of Kubernetes, right? This is really a tightly coupled plugin, or like more coupled plugin mechanism than the we're not going to try and apply Kubernetes auth across this.
Right. It's very similar in nature to CRI, in my view. It's splitting part of the function out of the binary, but it's still expected to be local.
It's really kind of external library, shared library.
Yeah, right.
Can someone post that to the KMS PR?
Yeah, I will.
Should we, I mean, God, I hate saying, I feel like we need a document that lays out, here's the different types of APIs, right? Because we have our API conventions, and that only applies to a certain set of our APIs.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you look at the bottom of this document, which is the list of stuff that I started on this morning to document about the Kubernetes design. At the bottom, I've been typing up this discussion about different extension mechanisms.
Okay. These are great notes. We got to turn this into something that is facing. Yeah.
That's why it says backlog. So at the very top of the document, there's a to-do, which is to review, like one complaint that we've had in a number of times in a number of places is there are these really mega threads on certain design issues, especially the older ones like 260 or things like that, and there's no TLDR at the end or like a pointer to a design proposal or anything. And now, especially since we're auto-closing issues or at least auto-pinging them, and at least for the ones that are still open, that's an opportunity to go take a look at those and say, oh yeah, this is actually what we decided here, and go document that. These were just some things that I had started accumulating in discussions, but in a number of other PR reviews, some question came to me before we had the formal SIG architecture, and there was some discussion and some decision. And I would say, please go update the API conventions or this other doc, and 9 times out of 10, that never happened. So I do want to make sure we start capturing these things in a more systematic way to build up that case law that Joe has talked about before. So we don't have to rehash the same issues over and over again. But anyway, Daniel, if you want to sign off and you're happy with where this landed, I think you can go now.
I'll take silent as in, yes, this is the plan, we're cool.
Or he got run over by the bus.
Okay, anything else on this issue before we move to the backlog generally? Since we were talking about that already. 1, 2. Okay. So yeah, so the backlog generally, there are a bunch of things in there. At the top is one thing that was actually discussed and decided in SIG architecture, which is the when do we use conditions versus fields versus whatever else thing. So that was another case where I had said, oh, someone please write this down. I waited for a while and nobody wrote it down. So I posted a summary to the bottom of that issue, but we need to get it into the API conventions doc. Paul Morey had, prior to the full discussion, Paul Morey had actually opened a PR to try to clarify it in the doc because similar discussions, there was confusion in SIG service catalog, which is mostly comprised of people who are new to Kubernetes and they couldn't figure out heads or tails what they were supposed to do, especially because it's inconsistent in different API resources. So if there are other things like this, I shared this with edit access to everyone in SIG architecture, and it is commentable by Kubernetes dev, and it's world readable. So if there are other things which you know have come up in reviews before or in prior SIG architecture, office hour questions, we should try to get these added to the backlog, even if you don't remember what the answer was or whatever. Just add them to the backlog, and we'll try to make sure they get resolved. I will be asking for, since part of the purpose of this SIG is to democratize this information and get it into more people's heads and get more people involved than just mine, I am going to ask other people to write up some of these things. Try to fan out the work a little bit. It's not super urgent because I'm going to be out until January after today, basically. But I would like to start getting sort of a system in place for documenting this kind of case law.
So would you imagine those as sort of like the last comment on the issue and then close the issue, or what is the right way to do this so it doesn't get muddled?
I was thinking we should write it down in actual documentation for Kubernetes, which currently is in kind of crossing between the development directory, like these are the conventions of the project, like the API conventions, the kube control conventions, and so on, and the design proposals directory where we have things like architecture.md. So I don't know if we want to reorganize that stuff yet again. I mean, at minimum, the devel directory is so big and unstructured, we're probably going to need to add structure. Like I had suggested creating an API machinery subpart, because a lot of this stuff relates to API machinery. But organization aside, my basic goal is to get this stuff in documents and then post links to the documents in the issues and close them.
Okay.
Not closed already. But not just have the content only in the issues, because that's totally undiscoverable. You know, we have something like 60,000 PRs and issues at this point. People are even complaining about the size of downloading the Git history now. Well, the Git history, I guess.
Don't do it on airplane Wi-Fi.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, well, I guess the Git history doesn't include the PR and issue comments, but all the PR and issue comments is one of the obstacles to uploading the Kubernetes project state into any other tool or platform. So we
already routinely break GitHub on long-running issues.
Yeah. So in any case, you can prune the history. Yeah, that came up in that discussion too. So I mean, if this is an area where you're interested in helping, like you don't need to know everything about Kubernetes to get started. I think this is a good way to learn about why Kubernetes is the way it is. So I just am going to make a plea for more people to volunteer to help out with that. And that's really about all I wanted to say about that right now. There was one other item that got added to the office hour agenda this morning. I don't know if they can make it. There was a steering committee thread about should we have a new repo for integration tests, or where should that stuff move to if it's moving. And previously, when this was discussed in the steering committee, we were trying to get the incubator unblock things that are blocked by the incubator process being frozen. We agreed that the highest priority was for organic project activity, things that would otherwise go into Kubernetes or another repo that don't really have to be there. That we would make a call in SIG architecture about whether it's in scope for the project or not, and where it should go. So to start on that, I wanted to get in place a set of make it clear who the approvers for those decisions would be. I'm going to start with the API approvers, because that's the one set of approvers we have. But I wrote up this owner's proposal, it's owners and subprojects proposal, and sent it out. I'm going to try to close on that with Aaron early in the year, early next year. but for now, I think there was a fair amount of consensus on the steering committee thread. I just want to raise it here since we said we would discuss it here. The conclusion was, well, we don't really have good infrastructure for managing lots of orgs, and it's just one thing, the integration tests. It's actually doesn't really strictly fall under the incubator process. It falls into the grandfathered class because it's moving existing code. So previously we had said that, if you're moving code out of Kubernetes, you can get a new repo in the Kubernetes org. And we also have said we don't like collection repos or mono repos, as I call them, like Kubernetes or Contrib, because it's really hard to manage for various reasons. So the consensus was we should just give them an integration testing repo in the Kubernetes org. Does anybody think that is not a good idea?
I guess I'm flummoxed because I was reading that thread this morning. Like, the use case and the plan behind it are opaque to me. I haven't seen what the details are and why. And I think in order for people to make an informed decision, they need to have at least outlined a plan or proposal of why they're trying to split it up, and what are the goals and non-goals of trying to get it into its own repo.
Okay. I have to admit I didn't look at the thread all that carefully.
My understanding was they wanted to use some integration test utils across integration tests and tests in different repos now. So now we've split the code up in different repos. They want to share the test infrastructure, but I don't know the exact code.
Okay. So here it was. Some of the code was moved into the kubectl repo. So now this creates a problem with using it in the Kubernetes repo and potentially in other repos. So I think it was relatively, that was the issue, that they wanted to make it easily vendorable into multiple repositories.
I guess the question was, how do we downscope this so that way it doesn't sprawl? Because there was other parts of the conversation that said, like, well, what about other testing utilities? What about the ETE framework? What about all the other utilities that could be leveraged from different locations? Because this conversation sprawls. So the scoping down to the specifics was what I was looking for.
I see. So can you just respond to that on that thread and CC SIG architecture?
I responded to that thread, but I'll CC our SIG architecture on that one.
Okay, thank you. I think that's reasonable. So just, sorry, Justin, just so people are aware, there are two other repos where code was being factored out. There was a util repo. I don't remember if that actually got created and populated to make generic utilities that aren't Kubernetes specific necessarily available to multiple repos. And then there was a common repo, which is Kubernetes specific libraries that aren't just being used by tests, but are maybe used by kubectl, by controllers, and other things. And that repo has been created, but not fully populated. So this would, I guess, be sort of another example of that, but specific to the integration test. Go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to bring up util and say, like, maybe this goes into util, but then we've essentially created a grab bag monorepo again if we start saying everything that is common goes into the...
Well, it would always turns into a kitchen sink. You name it util, it's going to be...
It would be common rather than util because it's Kubernetes specific, but sure.
Yeah, there's this weird line that I'd want to have people to think about before we start doing this, is like, what's the delineation? Where do we stop? Because otherwise we sprawl and recollect in different locations, which is kind of what's been happening, right? Either we have many repos that are all small and we agree to this, or we have, sprawly repos that, coalesce ideas into chunks.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, it's a Conway's law kind of thing, because what we see in Contrib is, when something big that gets a lot of activity moves in, like ingress or something like that, it tends to DOS everyone else and people stop paying attention, and then other things don't get maintained or curated. So it kind of depends on the overlap of set of people who are maintaining stuff. and the amount of cohesion of the stuff within the repo. So I don't know if there is a hard delineation, but I agree it's worth trying to come up with one. On the E2E test front, by the way, I'm a pretty big fan of moving E2E tests into a separate, E2E test framework into a separate repo. Not all the tests, but the test framework. Okay, so
there's the question around conformance tests, is that like conformance tests should be, it's dangerous to version conformance tests with the product, because then you think, well, I applied the latest conformance test to the latest product, right? And in reality, those things should have some degree of decoupling to have validity, right?
So we also do run the end-to-end tests, including the conformance tests, cross-version to try to catch those problems. So like we run the old E2E tests on the newer release on the theory that they should still pass. And that catches things like people use events to detect things in end-to-end tests, and those events aren't guaranteed to be stable with, which actually I guess should be an issue on the SIG architecture backlog, is conventions and deprecation policy and so on for events. Now that we have a more principled event API under development and a best practices guide that has been written, and we're about to overhaul all the events, is kind of a good opportunity to reset the clock and become more formal about what makes sense as an event and what doesn't make sense as an event, and what kinds of guarantees we have around that. So we may want a set of, I could imagine, for example, we have a set of event reviewers, which is potentially overlapping but distinct from like the overarching API review or approver set. As people, the way you become an authority on this is by doing the reviews and getting some intuition for and taste for what's good and what's bad. So there's an opportunity to grow some new people here. And Jordan can say how much fun it is to review lots of API PRs. You're muted, thankfully.
All I heard was my name. What?
No, I was just talking about how many API reviews you do and how much fun you had doing it. So anyway, that's about all for the agenda today. We don't have to take up all the time. Does anybody have anything else other than discussion of meetings between now and January to discuss?
I'm going to try and make some progress on the KEP process at some point. So more feedback there would be useful. And I think a big part of that's going to be tooling. I think getting the tooling out the gate will really make, I think we can talk about tooling, building the tooling and actually seeing like, hey, how does this come together? I think might be a good way to sort of light people's imaginations on where we can take this. So yeah, that's at least my plan. I'm not going to make any promises, but that's my plan.
The one thing I want to do is, as features start being identified for 110, I want to just pick some to ask to go through the KEP process.
My question was going to be ask and enforcement and whatnot for the future. So it sounds like 110 will probably be like the alpha stage deployment and feedback for how we do this stuff, but it's going to be is it going to be arbitrary, or is it going to be, I don't know how we pick versus.
I think it's got to be cooperative. I think there is this assumption that if you go through the KEP process, you're going to get more eyes on it. You may actually end up having an easier time just because it'll get some of that attention that it might not otherwise get.
Then
definitely a carrot that we can use.
Then why don't we send like an email to Devel or something that says, hey, for the 110 cycle, because I know people are already starting to submit proposals.
So here's the thing is that I don't know. I'm not comfortable with where the instructions are around KEP. I'm not comfortable with where the template is. I think it needs to be hosted in a place that's not buried 3 levels deep. I was a little bit surprised when Caleb actually brought it up at the contributor summit. I did not know that they were going to start pushing that. So I feel like, in my mind, I feel like we need to get we need to get a house in order. And we need to have this group via email or via like one of these meetings say, yes, we think that it's actually ready for people to start dating it. I'm not at that level of confidence yet.
I do think one clarification there is that the purpose of bringing up the summit was not to say this is going to be the enforcement. It was that people are routinely saying they have no idea what a KEPA is nor what it means, and they have no idea what it will actually mean in terms of implementing things. So it was just like,
and again, it's like I feel like we've been jumping the gun here without actually having wide buy-in, because like Quentin sent out email to everybody saying, here, try out KEP, and I'm like, we didn't talk about that, right? And the same thing, like if we're going to present it to the large group like Caleb did, I think there has to be a certain level of certainty, and we have to have some questions answered. We didn't have those questions answered. We didn't actually have that discussion, and so I think in some ways it created more stress and more confusion.
It also, the way
right now, the best thing to do is just race and let's fix it and let's get it where we need it to be. Sorry, Jordan, go ahead.
It was also presented as like, if you don't like the features repo, then we've got KEP. And to me, those aren't like one-to-one, because right now the features repo is like a place you can track, and it is pointing out to design docs, and KEP seems more like a replacement for the design proposal mishmash that still requires tooling and things around it. And so I think that confused a lot of people as well.
And I think, and Caleb, again, and I don't want to beat up on Caleb because he's not here, but again and again, he's tried to create this equivalency between KEPs and release notes. And I think that there's been a lot of pushback to that over time. And we've drifted pretty far from like the thing that he started. I don't know if he's been tracking it and whether he actually reviewed with where the template's at now when he went and he actually said, this is inspired by Rust, and we actually removed a lot of the Rust isms because they confused the hell out of people.
Yeah, different people definitely want to use it for different purposes, and that's part of the problem. We should, at some point, talk to SIG PM and SIG release about the process and where the boundaries of this process versus other processes should be and how they should relate. But in any case, so what is the proposal for what to do? I mean, people are going to be starting to do stuff, even though a lot of people will be out for the holidays, so that we can kind of hit the ground running in January.
Yeah, Daniel and I were talking kind of after the KEP thing at the Contributor Summit, and I think that the two things, if we're going to ask people to switch, the two things that seem really important are making it not accumulating processes, like not saying, well, here's a new thing and it doesn't actually really replace the old thing, so now do two things. So
well, it should replace at least the cargo cult proposal process that we have now.
Yeah, we should explicitly say, like, do this instead of this other thing. Yeah, not like here's a new process, but here's a improvement or another version or a replacement for this other process that you were doing.
So I think it's clear that it should replace that process.
Okay, and that, to me, that's like a really incremental thing. Like, here's a structured way to do proposals instead of cargo culting. Like, I like that. Like, put them here, structure them this way, keep referencing them from your GitHub issues, and then like we can incrementally.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
they're muted, Joe.
Getting the metadata in the tooling there is important because that'll actually add value above and beyond sort of the unstructured pile of documents that we have right now with proposals.
Okay, yes, so but it doesn't depend on like building all this tooling out to start getting value from it. Like it's there. Yep.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I think if we get some of that tooling out, if we get an index page, if we get sort of an attractive way to actually view and share and cross-link,
I mean,
it starts building some of the carrots.
Yeah. We can add tooling to our current process, so I don't think that's an argument in favor of this. Like, I think, sure, it'd be nice for everybody if all the processes had this format, but it's not nice for people who are writing processes to writing proposals to follow a new process. So you have to give these people a carrot. Otherwise, people are going to hate the new process. You got to replace something.
Yeah, a couple of the carrots that we can offer around that is that if you are doing wide-ranging changes, a KEP is a good way to get eyes on that so that you actually help to eliminate, last-minute surprises when people are like, oh, I
don't know. Why do you think that's going to be true? Like, people are going to send you 1,000 KEPs. You can't look at them all.
I think something that we can do as part of this group here is that we can actually have a queue of KEPs that we want to review. Right, and I think that's something that we have to manage. And not all caps necessarily has to pass through this
I
group.
think, Daniel,
But it's a way to organize how we look at stuff here.
The priority for KEPs is intended to be a short-term thing. Like, we don't expect everything to go through KEP process in 110. We're not ready for that.
Well, if you say the carrot is that SIG architecture will look at your thing if you make a KEP, I think you might get more KEPs than you expect.
Well, we can say we'll do 5 or 3 or however many. Right? We're looking for volunteers to go through this process, and we'll give them priority to alpha test it. I think something like that.
So can I ask a quick question here, because a few things have been brought up and I'm not sure how we would even do them, right? So we say SIG architecture is going to go look at your KEP, go do one. Where does somebody go to learn, like, what does it replace? What should I be doing? What, where does SIG architecture actually say, we'll review this? Like, where's that landing page that says, here's how we're consolidating processes on this. It's in an alpha state. This is what you get for it. So they can get an overview of why they should do it, what it's replacing, and what they get out of it. And then we talk about things, Joe was just talking about tools. So great. So we're going to create some tools to let you search KEPs and do things. Where does somebody start developing code for that? Sure, I'll go do it on my own GitHub repo, but then it's got to come in. And we've been talking about not wanting to do that anymore to bring it in. So where can somebody go to start building these tools in order to, even if they wanted to? So I kind of see two practical, like gathering this information we talk about needing and presenting KEPs in a nice way, and then building tooling to kind of support it. Where does it go? There's kind of the practical things. Where do we do this, and who's going to sign up for what?
Yeah, I think there's a marketing
so first
problem.
of all, yeah. So Matt, I think those are great points, and that's why I was uncomfortable with sort of how this was rolled out. Is that I would have liked to have that sort of clarity of like, here's what this thing is for, and have everybody sign off on that, and here's how you do this process, and have us group take a step back and look and say, does this actually improve things, or does it actually make things more complicated? I don't feel like we've done that sober look, and we just sort of stumbled forward with this without having all the right stuff in place. So I think that point is very well taken, and I think that's part of getting to the point where I'm going to feel more comfortable inviting other people to get involved in this process. We don't have that clarity there. In terms of how and where we build the tooling, I don't know. I mean, like, to some degree, it's like, we have a repo for the website, right? We can have a repo for the KEPs that can have code. We can have process and a way to host that. I would be in favor at some point, and that's something that we should talk about. I don't necessarily want to dig into it now, but should we have a separate Kubernetes/KEPs repo that actually just hosts that and move it out of the rest of the community repo, which really is sort of the touch point for SIGs to sort of a SIG index to some degree. I think that's something that we should look at also.
So I think there's two things here. One is that this is calling out that if we're going to make process changes across the project, or some SIG is driving a process change, we've got to get a lot better at how to do this, because one, it's
change management,
it's impossible to get consensus. And then when you think you have it, you realize you don't have it. And then so it creates this churn, which is really painful. So I'm hoping that maybe we retro how this went and maybe the ways that we can improve it in the future, because it feels very much like a cart rolling down a hill out of control, and that shouldn't be how it should, because these are all great things, and they're actually going to be essential to the survival of this project long term, but damn, this is hard.
Well, and I think we're all doing it part-time, right? And I think that's part of the problem here too. And so it's these fits and starts. There's not a lot of great communication.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I was really taken aback when this was brought up at the contributor summit. I was like, well,
I'm sorry, I'm partly responsible for that, so I will accept my part.
I had no idea that was going to be something like, because the KEP process has been driven out of like SIG architecture mostly, and then it was presented as a SIG PM thing, which really just confused the hell out of me.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that was gonna happen either. I think Caleb did one of the earlier drafts, and he's in SIG PM, so maybe that's why.
Yeah, and the product angle, though, is that, I mean, this is the thing, okay? Regardless if it's a proposal in the current cargo cult or if it's a KEP or whatever, the implementation process around how we track that work and tie it back to the work that's delivered is horrible. And I'm saying that from my experience now with multiple releases, and everybody who's worked on a release says, oh my God, trying to assemble all this into some conceivable thing is really hard. And it's a lot of human effort that is completely wasted and duplicative, and oh my God, it's the worst. So we have to stop the bleeding there, and the way we do that is to tie the work in some thread, and it has to eventually roll up to some description of what we're delivering. So if it's a KEP or a proposal, the reason that there was a decision to at least cursorily talk about KEP, which turned into a big conflagration at the summit, was that people need to know that that part eventually is going to change as well, but they're probably going to see the implementation details change faster. So that was, I take personal responsibility for the shitty rollout there, and I'm sorry
it's
that
just a matter of like as we make top-down changes, right? Which is like as we get more governance, as we have the steering committee, as we actually give SIGs more power to actually make decisions, we're going to have places where we have some top-down changes. And anytime when you're doing that, you have to communicate it well, and you have to have clarity, and you can't just sort of dribble it out with sort of say think and weasel words and that type of stuff. So we got to get on the same page. We got to make sure that we communicate clearly.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is not that many of the contributors were at the contributor summit.
So with all this in mind, though, so Joe brought up some totally actionable things, like, can we figure out where we want to stick KEPs and then go create a nice index, a nice README, and move the template over there and move the KEPs we have there and get it, at least that place ready to go and know what that place is, because that's something we can do between now and when we meet again. I'll sign up to start moving stuff. It's moving docs and writing. Can do that.
I mean, does anybody object to KEPs, to a KEPs repo?
So if we move, are we going to move the existing design proposals?
I think you'd have to do it piecemeal. So like if you're going to vet your tooling, you're going to need a history of KEPs to tie together. So you might want to pick a specific use case or user story where features kind of chain down from one meta feature, which happens all over that repo. But you'd have to beautiful mind those pieces together, as Jace mentioned earlier, and then use that as an example for the tooling, and then you can walk backwards. So I think you start small, but I do think you need to, in order to make sanity of the tooling, you will need to eventually retrofit the existing proposals into this.
So I mean, like I want to say I'm going to sign up to do this, but I'm careful of, I know how hard it is to sign up. But like, would it be worthwhile to say, let's pick say 5 of those proposals that we think are probably the most cornerstone and the most important, and let's use those as our guinea pigs to essentially move those into the KEP repo and sort of like retroactively KEPify them.
Joe, why do you want to move proposals out of the community repo?
So I think they're not very discoverable right now. I think that there's the metadata around those things is very confusing. What's up to date, how they relate to each other, which ones actually end up are current and which ones are not.
But that's content, not location. In terms of discoverability, with an index could solve that. Putting it into one of 90 repos is not going to necessarily make it more discoverable.
So I would actually say that one of the things about creating a KEP repo and at least moving KEP 1 and the template and putting a README in there is you can also create a docs directory and then tie that into GitHub Pages, and we can point a K8S thing at it. And then every time there's a change, we can do certain things to rebuild this. There are options there for us to start building a very basic site right in that repo to start doing things. It won't be fancy, but it'll be a start, and it'll have one home place. And if we just do that as a first step, and then the second step, besides the template and KEP 1, is if you want to pick other design proposals and turn them into KEPs and bring them in, you now have a template and a place to do that, and it's a top level thing. That's the interesting thing to me, although we can make other things work too.
But I mean, right now, I look at the community repo, and the README says nothing about proposals there. It's all about SIGs. And proposals are quick quiz. Are they under Kubernetes/community/community or Kubernetes/community/contributors?
I'm not saying they're discoverable today. I'm saying they could be made discoverable. I'm not sure I want to move all the existing proposals again. And there's currently content that's in the developer directory, which is relevant. They're not proposals specifically, but it's about how to develop Kubernetes. So I don't want to move the proposals to be separate from the other developer documentation. And I agree that is a discoverability issue and that we could make nicer documentation, and I would love it if people worked on that, but I think that applies to how do you contribute to Kubernetes, how do you do development, how do you understand the kubelet code, like all those kinds of things, it applies pretty equally well, or even to how is the project organized, people organized around SIGs and things like that.
Okay, then can we alternatively maybe at the top of the community repo get a KEPs directory and we move the template KEP1 and put a nice README in there that fills this stuff out with a landing page so we have a place to point people to? That's very, I mean, it would keep it in the community repo. We're not talking about moving design proposals yet. That would be a different step if something made sense to move. And you just bring KEP1 and the template and put a nice README in there. And then we can look at what to bring in process-wise from that, whether it's a brand new KEP that somebody submits or if it's a design proposal that somebody wants to do, which would be a new KEP based on a design proposal. That would be like a second step. Would that be okay?
That sounds great.
Okay.
And the only thing that it affects for any other part of the process, like issues, GitHub issues, whatever, instead of linking to a proposal, we'll now link to a KEP. And so like it decouples all of our existing integrations with everything else. It's just what document do you reference? And then like as we figure out how to tie more things to KEPs, like automatically via tooling or whatever, we can kind of supplant other parts of the process as well. But
I'm also in favor, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to change which repo you're filing PRs to or anything. I'm also very in favor of streamlining the top-level README in the community repo and adding more hierarchy there, and starting to create a documentation site for the community repo with all the contributor documentation split into, you know, the developer guide and the proposal process and the people SIG organization stuff and governance and whatever else.
Okay, so that's an interesting idea. So if we were going to have a project-facing versus user-facing site, right?
Yes, exactly.
What would we call that? Community.kates.io? Would we call it dev.kates.io?
Community. And it makes it obvious the connection to the community repo.
But it doesn't, I hear you, but I think there's also, community has a sort of like soft, let's sort of like, how do we like, you know, manage relationships, which is, I think in some ways different from like, how do we actually record and you know, talk about the hard architectural, you know, decisions and processes and stuff like that. I know they're related, but community to me doesn't bring that across.
Okay, I mean, community dev, like I don't have a strong opinion. I've tried to avoid
dev is not great either. I agree. Yeah,
in most cases, because people talk about application developers or ecosystem developers, people building on Kubernetes or running on Kubernetes.
What about contrib?
No, contrib has this connotation of like a bucket where you put a bunch of crap that people gave you that you don't want to say no to.
Contributors.
That sounds like community. No, I didn't say
so
that.
Anyway, we can figure out the naming, and we can even change it later once we like do a formal launch. So people think about that. And
okay, so what I'm hearing here is a couple of things, and correct me if I'm wrong. Top level directory in community around KEPs is okay. We can move some of the process in the README there. There's an ask to, can we start actually improving the README on community to actually make that be more useful? Maybe call out sort of the most common things. Now some of this actually starts overlapping with the contribac stuff and the contributor guide stuff that I know that George and company have been looking at, and so we need to close the loop with him on that.
Drop contribacs an email.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that we can start building tooling to have a parallel site to kates.io that is really community facing, where we can have an information architecture on that.
Yeah, I know the contributor guide stuff was discussed a little in SIG docs. I don't know what progress or decisions were made there, so we may just want to poke them about that.
I honestly, I hesitate to. I mean, like, do we want to have SIG docs actually be a gatekeeper for this internal facing documentation?
I think the answer is no, and they have more than enough work to do already.
I know, right? That's part of it, right?
But in communication-wise, I think it would be useful just to let them know what we think we want to do and why, so they're aware of that. Because
so what we've done is we've taken the KEP process and then we've grown it to a, you know, the real thing we need is a community-facing, you know, readable site that's not just a bunch of markdown pages on GitHub.
Yes.
That's not crazy. And KEP is a subset of that.
So since there's like 2 minutes left, does anybody want to volunteer to do the KEP directory move and README? If not, I will. PR.
I'll review that PR, Matt.
Okay.
I'm happy to review too.
Great. I'll CC you too when it's ready to go.
And I want to sign up. My heart says yes. My calendar says no.
And that's the reason I volunteered, because my calendar has some time in it.
Great. Thanks, everybody. This is a really productive meeting. This is nice to see. And thanks, Daniel, if you're still around for coming in early.
So I just posted a link to one of the discussions on the developer guide to the chat.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.